base it on gold or silver. And, it can be done. It'll take a little bit of transition time, but I don't think it'll take as long as most people think. Once there is a real money out there based on gold or silver, it'll become very much in demand, and the preference will be, well, I'd rather transact in this gold dollar or silver dollar than I want to in the Federal Reserve dollar. And so the Federal Reserve dollars will be discounted, and then the next week they'll be discounted more, and the following week they'll be discounted even more until finally they'll become just as worthless as they really are, and the nation will gradually have swung over to the new gold or silver dollar, and those will expand quite rapidly in quantity as gold and silver mining picks up, and as people take their old hoards of gold and silver and turn it in and convert it into money and so forth. It can be done, it must be done, and I don't think it'll be a very difficult transition.
Here's a question. This was relating to the IRS, and it's a question I've asked you in the past. This comes from Roger in Minneapolis. He says, are not the Federal Reserve and the IRS bed partners, and does not one work hand in hand with the other?
I believe the answer to that is yes. I don't think they're official partners. They're different institutions. They were both created, by the way, by the same people. The same group that I mentioned before, not all of them, but the primary ones, Aldrich in particular, as I recall, not only introduced the Federal Reserve Act, but was the key mover behind the income tax. So they do work hand in hand. The income tax was designed primarily to not to raise revenue, and this comes as a shock to people. The income tax is not there to raise money for the government spending. The income tax is there to control the people. It's to do some social engineering. It's to redistribute wealth. It's to give the politicians the power to reward their friends and punish their enemies economically by giving them special loopholes or special penalties. If the income tax were abolished today, the government would have just as much money as it always has had and needs, simply by using the Federal Reserve System to create it out of thin air. And the tax would go from the income tax to the inflation tax.
Right.
So the purpose of the IRS is not to raise revenue, but to control the people. And I think that was part of the plan by those who drafted both the Federal Reserve and the income tax.
Now, Dr. Gene in Indianapolis is asking, by stopping the Fed, wouldn't this also stop the IRS?
Let me think about that for a minute. I don't see why it would. Maybe there's some connection I can't think of. But if they stop the Fed and return to a sound monetary system, I don't see any reason that the IRS could not continue, but it would be collecting real money instead of funny money.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. There's so many questions here, so many people submitting, and I hate to say we're not going to be able to get to all these questions. I mean, I've got 38 questions I still haven't even looked at yet, and I dare hit refresh. Okay, now 44 questions have just filled my queue. Let's go down here and take a look at, Marwan in North Virginia is asking, can the states and commonwealths coin their own money under the current system bypassing the Fed?
Yes. Yeah, there's nothing prohibiting a state from issuing its own money if it wishes to, provided the money is backed by something of value. The states are prohibited from issuing bills of credit, according to the Constitution. That means money based on credit or loans or promises. They're not allowed to do that. But there's nothing stopping a state from issuing money backed by gold or silver. I think it'd be a wonderful idea.
And I believe there is a move for that going on in the country. But let's jump across to we've got a question being submitted from the United Kingdom. Steve Sexton in Scotland is asking, is the Bank of England the same as the Fed? And if so, what ways?
The Federal Reserve System was based upon the Bank of England. The Bank of England is perhaps the granddaddy of all of the central banks of the world. And one of the purposes of Max Warburg, and one of the functions of Max Warburg at this meeting where they created the Federal Reserve System on Jekyll Island, was to explain to the American bankers how the Bank of England and other central banks in Europe worked. So they consciously copied the Bank of England when they created the Federal Reserve System. And in what way? Well, the basic arrangement is that it's a cartel. They created a cartel of the largest banks, and they passed a law in which the party politicians were convinced to give this group of banks the monopoly power to create the nation's money, and they gave them the right to do it out of thin air. It's an amazing scam when you think about it, but that was all started and perfected by the Bank of England.
We've got another question here from, Abe in Ventura. He's asking, in your opinion, what is the number one most effective and powerful action that we can take to end the Fed?
I have to think about that for a minute. The number one most powerful action we can take to end the Fed. Well, I know how to answer that question. Mm-hmm. I think Abe, perhaps I'm misreading the question, but it sounds as though Abe wants a magic bullet.
We all want the magic bullet to end the Fed.
Yeah. If I'm misunderstanding that, Abe, I apologize. But I know there's a great temptation to say, what can we do to end the Fed? One thing. Don't confuse it with 2 or 3 or 5 things. We want to do it now. We want to do it in the next election. It can't be done that way. There's no one thing that's going to do it, and it certainly is not going to be done by the next election. But the most important thing in a series of steps that will end the Fed is to educate the public as to the nature of the Fed so that they can then bring about political pressure on these politicians, or better yet, replace these politicians that are there with new ones who understand the Fed and are not cowed by it. So I think the most important single and first step we can do is to spread the word about the nature of the Fed like you're trying to do, Gary.
Yeah, I agree. I think winning in the court of public opinion will provide the groundswell of support that is needed to put the pressure on the legislative officials to get rid of the Federal Reserve System. So as you're watching this video, I would like to ask you, the viewer, to please forward this link to your friends, to your family. Help them to understand what we're talking about here and why it is so important to end the Federal Reserve System. And we've got so many questions here. It's just overwhelming to go through. Even with our administrators, they have to go through and take the pertinent questions, too. It's just amazing. Let's see here. We have, let's go down to, does the Fed pay taxes on its profits? This comes from, again, Marwin in North Virginia.
Does the Fed pay taxes on its profits? I presume by that talking about the Reserve System, and the answer to that would be no, because the Fed does not make profits. We have to remember, again, what the Fed is. The Federal Reserve System is a cartel. It's not a profit-making organization as such. It doesn't make profit. It's not designed to keep profit and distribute profit to its stockholders, for example. All the banks themselves are stockholders, but that's kind of a meaningless minority thing. There is no profit in the Fed. The Fed is a regulatory body. It controls the banks by the banks. The banks themselves are controlling themselves. The profit in the system doesn't come from the Federal Reserve. It comes from the banks. Remember, the banks are the masters here. The profit is in the banks. The banks have the ability to create money out of nothing,